I guess all of you know that I'm Peter Breggin. I'm a psychiatrist in Bethesda, Maryland. I have a private practice, and I teach at Johns Hopkins University in the counseling department, not the psychiatry department. I'm very critical of psychiatry, including at the university I teach at. And I'm the director of the International Center for the Study of Psychiatry and Psychology, which is a network of professionals who support each other in doing what we think is right. And I'll be talking about what we think is right, what I think is right. I've written, as the PA system was saying, a number of books. I think they're up to 14 or so now. But the best known ones are Toxic Psychiatry, Talking Back to Prozac, and now Talking Back to Ritalin. Although my favorite little book, which was published by a medical publisher, is The Heart of Being Helpful, which came out a couple of years ago, which is about my view of how to help people. And perhaps we'll get into that later. Today the subject is one that I find very dismaying, disheartening, discouraging, but also inspiring in the sense of demanding attention. And that is the mass, literally mass drugging of our children that's taking place now. No one has accurate estimates because our government doesn't require any, but there are probably 4 million, 5 million children on Ritalin, and many millions more on all the other psychiatric drugs, because all the adult psychiatric drugs are being given to children now. And it's not uncommon at all to hear about schools where 10, 20, 30% of the children are on drugs. Even 3 years ago, the International Narcotics Control Board, which is very upset about what's happening in America, estimated that 10, 12% of our boys were on stimulant drugs, and it's much higher now. These are incredible figures. This is bizarre. This is the most amazing thing. It's a vast social experiment in drugging kids. The drugs themselves are what's called the psychostimulants. They include Ritalin, which is biochemically methylphenidate, and then the amphetamines. The main amphetamine is dexedrine, dextroamphetamine, and that appears as dexedrine, but also it appears as Adderall, which is a particular mixture of amphetamine, and also methamphetamine, which many of you, it would send chills through your spine to think that your child was using methamphetamine, and methamphetamine, which is sold given to children under the names of Dizoxin and Gradumet. So we are literally pouring into our children drugs that for generations have been viewed as dangerous street drugs, the stimulants. Another drug is Pemelin or Silert. That is now more studies showing that it can kill some children through liver disease, and it's not even thought to be very effective, and probably it's going to be dropping out of use, more and more out of use, and it's not an amphetamine. All these drugs, except for Pemelin, but methamphetamine, amphetamine, and Ritalin, all are Schedule II drugs with the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. This is an international treaty. All the civilized nations, all pretty much the nations of the world, belong to this, and they all rate Ritalin in the same category with amphetamine, methamphetamine, cocaine, morphine, Demerol, the highest addictive schedule of a drug that can be used at all in medicine. And Ritalin has in fact been a drug of abuse on and off in different parts of the world for decades. The first use of stimulants to control children that's been documented was in the 30s. This is not a new idea at all. It's just an idea that the drug companies and psychiatry have finally sold to the public. In 1937, a doctor gave Benzedrine, one of the first of these drugs, and they're all basically the same clinically, to a bunch of children in a mental hospital, and the kids were quieter. And he wrote this up and published it. He talked about how they were tired, lethargic, slowed down, and made a very honest description, but he thought it was positive because these kids were a problem. The Ritalin was approved in 1955 by the FDA, and subsequently, when other forms of it, the long-acting, which is around now, SR, were approved, they simply based the approval basically on the original studies. So I asked the FDA for the original studies under the Freedom of Information Act, and it was so long ago they'd lost them. They literally couldn't produce the approval studies for Ritalin. The drug has gone through cycles of being extremely criticized. In the early 1970s, there was an estimate of 200,000 or 300,000 children at the most, somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 children on Ritalin, and that was sufficiently outrageous to some people that Congress held hearings that were critical of giving that many children a drug to control their behavior. And it perhaps slowed things down for a little bit, but my profession has always been impervious to criticism from society at large. Psychiatry has been impervious from the beginning. Many of you, for example, probably think that electroshock went out with cuckoo's nest. We do more electroshock now than we ever have. We are shocking mostly elderly women now. Many of you may think that lobotomy was given up voluntarily by the profession. In fact, it still goes on, and the only reason we don't have a huge amount of lobotomy is that I took several years out of my life in the 70s. That's how I got into reform work. I got so outraged at lobotomy coming back, and they were doing lobotomies on hyperactive children, and I was just outraged. And I conducted an international campaign. That's how my center got formed. And a number of the children were black children, so I have 2 black congressmen, Dellums from California on my board and Stokes from Cleveland. We've grown old together. They're retiring. I'm not. Psychiatry has only responded to force in terms of containing its biological ambitions, its ambitions to drug, to shock, to lobotomize. I say this as a psychiatrist. It's embarrassing to say, and it's simply true. The current tremendous escalation in the use of these drugs has absolutely nothing to do with science. My profession is not driven by science, contrary to all the articles you read in the Denver Post or the Washington Post or the New York Times. The profession is driven by politics, and it has now been taken over by the biological wing. It's sort of like 2 competing parties. On the one hand, there's a psychological party, and then there's the biological party. Well, the biological party was in trouble in the early 70s. And this is a story I tell, by the way, in Toxic Psychiatry, real heavy documentation on the politics of this. And the profession consciously decided in the early 70s that to survive, to compete with the psychology wing, and in particular to compete with female social workers and psychologists who weren't even psychiatrists, to whom all the women patients were beginning to flock in the 70s. See, in the 70s, women got much more empowered in mental health, and yet particularly social work and clinical psychology, also family therapy. And psychiatrists were getting no business anymore. They consciously got together with the drug companies and said, we've got to develop a campaign to convince the public, to convince Congress, and to convince everybody that human distress, they don't call it that, but that these problems are mental illnesses suitable for drugs, and that psychiatrists have to always be supervising and in charge, and that therapy is a side thing. And what they did was begin to take money to finance all the journals. All the journals are now financed by drug companies, not just through ads. They'll finance sending the journals free to the doctors. 90% of the research is financed by the drug companies. All of the major conferences that are held every year are financed by the drug companies. Money is given just outright to the national associations. A number of years ago, when President Bush went to Japan, turned out he vomited on the premier of Japan, and it came out that he had taken Halcyon, a sleeping pill, to regulate his sleep on the airplane. And the question was raised in the New York Times, why was our president getting a pill, Halcyon, that was banned in England for causing, and remember, this is our president going abroad on a mission, banned in England for memory loss, paranoia, and depression. Raised that, why is this happening? So I wrote to the New York Times and I said, consider the fact that the maker of this drug just gave $1.5 million cash, no strings attached, to the American Psychiatric Association. Just gave them this money. Well, they published the letter. This so upset the Psychiatric Association that they made an astonishing confession. They said something in a letter that when I've said it to the press, they've said I'm a conspiracy theorist. They wrote in the letter, Breggin is really off base. We have a partnership with the drug companies. An ethical, responsible partnership, openly in print. And that's the situation we're now in. The drug companies are partners with organized psychiatry, with its leadership. By the time your local pediatrician, psychiatrist, or neurologist hears a thing about a drug, it has been so filtered through that partnership that he or she hasn't the faintest idea what the drugs really do. It's totally filtered and controlled. And at every level, it's controlled, at every single level. It used to be that the FDA was a watchdog of sufficient strength that every year the drug companies fought against funding it. They didn't want it established. The AMA fought against it, didn't want it established. Now, the drug companies and the health providers take out ads to support, encouraging Congress to give more money to the FDA. That tells you that the watchdog is now a corporate pet. The growling days are over. In addition, a number of other factors have been coming into play that particularly come to bear on children. In the 60s, some of you are as old as I am, remember all the books that came out about reforming education, how our schools weren't meeting the needs of our children. There were national conferences, government-sponsored commissions, all of them concluding that the schools were not meeting the kids' needs. What came of school reform? Nothing. When the huge inflation hit in the 70s, when the economy got tight, it all went down the drain. Our schools got bigger, our teachers got dumber, the curriculums got more boring. And some of you may have noticed in the past year there have been multiple exposés about how our children don't read and they don't do math. Now, do we have an epidemic of reading disorders and math disorders? It's ridiculous. It's not what's going on. Another important thing that happened, of course, was that the family began to shift and change. In particular, men began to abandon their families in droves in every class and every race. So the more and more we have women trying to raise boys on their own, which is an extremely stressful and difficult situation. If I wanted to torture somebody, I'd make them a 25-year-old woman trying to raise a 5-year-old boy without a father around and saying, knock it off, kid. I remember when my son Ben, who's an incredibly independent boy, he used to take advantage of his mother so much, and I said to him finally, I said, Ben, you have to listen to your mother the way you listen to me. And he said, but your voice is so much darker. And this is the truth. This is, I don't know whether it's biological or strictly cultural, but clearly men were built more to intimidate than women, are built that way. It's probably part of our function. But for whatever reason, it is extremely difficult, and especially in a society where little boys are taught from an early age to disrespect little girls and women alike. So you take these little boys who have not been taught to respect, and particularly not to respect anybody that's a girl or a woman, and then you don't even have a father raising them. Even if he's in the house, he's nowadays in my hometown of Bethesda, where all the men are there, or a lot of the men, not all, a lot of the men are there, but they're all busy working, making a lot of money, being lawyers, being whatever, doctors.